Recording. All right. Well, again, good morning, brothers. It's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time to join. Uh, I'm hoping today and next week, next couple of weeks, to be able to do a little bit more. Just been going through the example from John 4, just in how to do the narrative analysis, and then, Lord willing, be able to get to the exegetical homiletical idea using John 4 as an example. So we'll see what the Lord allows in the next few weeks. But then we have almost a little less than 5 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, we'll be gathering together in Cebu, be able to fellowship with one another, hear you guys preach, and then start working on poetry together, which will be, I think, some unique opportunities there, some ways to look at the biblical poetry and maybe you hadn't considered before, just how to evaluate that. But we'll save that for next month. This morning, want to focus our attention on, again, a narrative analysis using John 4 as the example. And we're at the stage right now in the narrative analysis where we're looking at the characters. We've looked at the setting before, the scene analysis. The next step is consider the characters. And here's where we take a step back. The scene analysis is sort of where we start looking at the details in the story, right? Breaking it down into its scenes, looking at each situation, each scene, and trying to identify what's the main idea from this scene, the main thing that happened, because those scenes build on each other to help show us the plot of the story. So the scene analysis is really where we break it down into its pieces. The character analysis is where we then step back again and look at the story as a whole and just focus on the main characters in the story. Each scene we focus on the key characters for that scene. And sometimes there may be a character in that scene that's not one of the main characters of the story overall. And so the character analysis just causes us, let's step back and consider the key characters and what they have said and what they have done that seem to be significant in the story. All right. And so that's the difference in this step is we're backing up, looking at the story as a whole and focusing on the main characters in that story. And so if you'll remember from class, the main characters we'll talk about in a moment here. So the procedure for doing the character analysis is this time reading through the story again several times, making observations. I know we've made observations already, but this is such an important principle or practice in Bible study, is just reading a lot and observing. And again, these observations, I want to just remind you guys, because some of you guys sort of use observations, you're just summarizing verses. That's not what observations are. Observations are simply just noticing things. Sometimes it could be an interpretive idea. You know, it can be a hypothesis that you think, you might see make some interpretation, but that's not the goal. That would just be an observation at this point. Things you notice, things repeated, questions you have, anything that's confusing in the story, anything that sticks out in the story. You know, sometimes you might be reading, say, this event reminds me of another story, or it's just things that you see. So make sure you're doing that. Don't just summarize the verses through the story. That's not observations. You're going to do that later. So in this particular part of character analysis, I have you again just read through the story a few more times, sometimes maybe in other translations, and then make observations. And then after that is identify and categorize each character. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, we want to identify, there's really 5 main characters or categories of character in a typical story. We have the protagonist, which is the main character. And the protagonist could be good or bad. Generally, they're good. Generally, they're like the hero of the story, but not always. They're the main character around which the story surrounds, focuses on. The antagonist is the character or characters who oppose the protagonist. And they oppose the protagonist by creating or increasing the problem in the story. And this is the key step, or the key thing to look for in stories, brothers, is what is the problem in the story? The story is going to center around that. Okay? What's the problem in this story? And then that problem then will help you identify, okay, who's the protagonist? Who is encountering this problem? And then the antagonist is who is creating the problem or making it worse or increasing the problem. Okay, this is a sort of a standard approach in stories, is you've got a main character experiencing a problem, and how are they going to solve this problem? How are they going to get through this problem? And that's really what frames the story. That's what draws us in. That's what gets our attention. And biblical narrative is no different. There's a main character that encounters a problem or an issue that is being brought upon them by the antagonist, another main character, or is being increased or made worse by another character, the antagonist in the story. And so, but really, a helpful thing to remember is identifying what seems to be the main problem in the story. So if you're looking at Ruth, Book of Ruth, what's the main problem in that story? And who is it happening to? Those of you who have Ruth. I'm looking at the book overall, the story overall. What seems to be the main problem?
Offspring, offspring.
Okay, we learn that as we go through, that there's really two problems going on. There's one problem in the background of the story, the setting, right? That's revealed in the very first verse, right? And it came about in the days of the judges,
Judges.
right? Already, if we know the history, we know there's a problem, right? This is a big issue, right? Because what was it like in the days of the judges? Oh, none of us would have wanted to live at that time, right? No authority, no structure, no law, just all kinds of wicked things happening. And this is the background of the story. Israel's in trouble. But in the story itself, there's a problem that surfaces. What is that problem within the story? And who does it happen to?
Naomi.
Yeah, Naomi, right? She's the main character in the story overall, because she's the one encountering the problem. What's the problem? She lost her husband, she lost her sons. She's going back to Jerusalem with a Moabite woman. It's like in the days of the judges. This is not good. She has no one to provide for her, no one to care for her except Ruth, who's a Moabite, a foreigner, right? The story repeats that over and over, doesn't it? The Moabite, the Moabite, Moabite. The author's making a point. This is the only one that stands with Naomi. What's going to happen to these two widows? All right, so Naomi really is the central human character in the story. And the antagonist, who's causing the problem? Who brought the problem?
Naomi, Naomi blamed God.
Yeah,
God.
yeah, God seems to be the antagonist, doesn't he? Now, of course, God is good and perfect, and
Hmm.
the problem isn't evil, right? Because God is the one who sovereignly ordained it. And, some would argue because of, they went away to, to Moab, so they're suffering consequences for that. But, and that could be part of the case. But in the big picture of the story, you've got this widow who now is alone, just has a Moabite widow with her. And what are they going to do? What's going to happen to them? Okay, so now you have the arc of the plot as well, but it also helps you identify the main characters. Naomi is the central character. The story begins and ends with her, right? The last scene, she's sitting with the baby grandson on her lap. Um, the story begins with her losing her husband and her sons. But then also, as Stephen mentioned, there's a second problem in the background that the end of the story helps us to, or we see a resolution, right? And what's the bigger problem? Just as Naomi and Ruth were in a difficult situation and God's providence cared for them, so too Israel was in a bad place, a difficult situation. And the story ends with God brought a godly king. And then we can look at the story and take a step back even further and looking at it in the Bible overall, right? And how we were in a bad place and God brought a redeemer for us as well. But that's that's not part of what the author's doing in that story, but that's definitely a connection we can make as believers. Okay, so how about Jonah? See, I'm trying to help you guys out here. So let's think about Jonah for a minute. What's the problem in Jonah? I really should say, who's the problem in Jonah? All right.
Jonah.
Jonah. Yeah, Jonah's not the protagonist, right? He's actually the one causing the problem because he's trying to, right? Uh, First, he disobeys God by not going when God tells him to go. Eventually, he goes, but he's not happy that he's there, and he's mad at God when God shows mercy, right? So we have God in the story wanting to show compassion, but Jonah is trying to hinder that. So Jonah's the problem. He's the antagonist. God is the protagonist. Does that make sense? So then the arc of the story really is God seeking to show compassion to the lost, and Jonah is trying to uh, push back on that. And so then there's a lesson there. And again, just like in Ruth, the main idea or theme or purpose of the story is revealed at the very end. But in identifying the main characters, just like in identifying the plot, figuring out the main problem in the story will guide and direct you towards that. And then every part of the book overall will somehow connect to that resolving that problem, or at least, what's going to happen from that problem. But at this stage, when you're doing character analysis, identifying the problem is a very helpful and key thing to do to then be able to identify, okay, who is the main character in the story because the problem is happening to them, and who is the one that's creating or increasing or making the problem worse. That's your antagonist. All right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now in each part of the book, so you guys were assigned a particular chapter from Ruth or a chapter from Jonah. And so, like, for example, in Ruth 3, I think, Stephen, did you have that or Nigel did? I think maybe Nigel had Ruth chapter 3.
Yes, Ruth 3.
We were talking about that last week. So in that part of the story, Naomi's not in Ruth 3. She tells Ruth, hey, go basically make a marriage proposal to Boaz. But Ruth 3, Naomi, the main character of the whole story, isn't in Ruth 3. So in Ruth 3, you have main characters of Boaz and Ruth. And what is the problem in that segment of the book? Right? What's the issue there, right? Is will Boaz
Yeah.
how
Will
will he
Boaz marry?
what's that?
Will Boaz marry or redeem?
Yeah. How's he going to respond to Ruth's and really Naomi's request?
Mm-mm.
Right? Um, So you have sort of in the book overall of Ruth, there's a problem. And then in Ruth 3, the problem is connected to the problem of the book overall, but it's now a little more refined in that there seems to be a possible solution here to the big problem of who's going to care for Naomi and Ruth. And it seems to be Boaz. But in Ruth 3, we don't know that yet. So the problem there is what's going to happen when Ruth approaches Boaz in the middle of the night and basically makes a marriage proposal. Okay. So you have in Ruth 3, you have sort of a smaller pericope or account, but it's still connected to the bigger account. So what you guys want to do is you're going to have a specific chapter. You want to identify within that chapter. Each chapter is sort of one act in the whole story, right? Jonah has 4 acts, and so does Ruth. Each chapter is like one particular smaller story in the big story. And so each of the smaller stories sort of have their situation, the problem, and a climax resolution, but they are connected still to the bigger story. And so what you want to be able to do is not only follow the plot within the chapter you're focused on, but then how does that connect to the bigger story? Okay. So for Jonah, how is God showing compassion in that smaller story, right? Because that's the theme of the book. In Ruth, how is God's providence working on behalf of Naomi and Ruth in the arc of that story? And how does chapter 2 or 3 or 1 or 4 fit into that? Okay. It's like this in every narrative, right? You're going to be also, you're doing the Gospel of John. Okay. And we know John tells us the purpose of his book, right? He tells us very explicitly, these things have been written so that you would believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you may have life in his name, right? So right there, John says, look, I wrote all of these stories as signs to demonstrate the signs that Jesus performed that shows who he is so that you would believe. And so the whole gospel, the arc of the whole gospel is going to be connected to that purpose. And each story is going to be in some way linked to that purpose, but it's also going to be linked to the stories around it. And so you want to be able to identify what that link is. All right. And so what helps us is first understanding the setting of the whole story, the book as a whole, and then going through the scenes of each particular story and looking for the information, the key characters, the key points, what the narrator says, the summary of that scene. But now we're looking at those key characters in the story as a whole. All right. And so with that, we identify the main characters by the problem in the story, the protagonist, the main character, the antagonist, and then we have this group called the foils. Now, the foils are sometimes a little bit more challenging to figure out because you have other characters in the story, right? Like in the story of Ruth, you have Naomi, the main character, but then you have Ruth and you have Boaz. And then you have this other kinsman redeemer guy who has no name. And then you have smaller characters like the workers in the field and the women who speak to Naomi at the beginning and the end. So sometimes these additional characters are just that. They're just there in the story to fill out the story. But sometimes the author places these characters in the story because in some way they compare or contrast to the main characters. All right. If they are given as a comparison or a contrast to the main character, you would call them a foil. Okay, a foil is just set against or in comparison to one of the main characters in the account. All right, so just because there may be another character in the story doesn't mean they're a foil. They could be. So how do you know if they're a foil or not? You have to ask, well, does this character or these characters, do they seem to be providing a comparison or a contrast to the antagonist or protagonist? And if they do, then you could say, okay, these seem to they're foils. So we're thinking of Jonah, chapter 1, and obviously the main character, other characters there are the sailors. Now, do they in some way present a comparison or a contrast to God or Jonah? That's a question you'd want to ask. I would say they could. They could be a contrast to Jonah. The Ninevites, were they a contrast or comparison to God or to Jonah? I think they may fill that role as a contrast to Jonah. They are repentant. They are humble. Jonah was not. Um, in Ruth, you're looking at Boaz and Ruth. They are very key characters in that story. They're not the main character of the story overall, but they play a significant role. And I think in some ways serve as a comparison or a contrast to the main characters. Certainly, God uses Boaz as a means to show his kindness and mercy to Naomi and to Ruth. So, but this is what you want to think about is there are other characters in the story besides the antagonist and protagonist, and they play the role of a foil if you can show how they are compare or contrast with those main characters. Any questions on that? Does that make sense?
Yes, Dr. Doom.
Okay.
I'm still confused about the foils pastor thing.
Okay.
Especially in chapter 3 of Ruth. So I know that when you look at the overarching story, we know that God is somehow creating the situation, and then Naomi is the protagonist. Now, in connection to chapter 3, which Naomi just gave instructions on how to propose to Ruth, and it's between Boaz and Ruth, right?
Yeah.
So I'm confused, especially in the foils. So for the foils, the only indicator there is to have a contrast to the main character. Is that right, Pastor Tim?
Or comparison. They
Or
could be.
comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, and in that part in Ruth 3, you really don't have an antagonist in that chapter. You don't have somebody creating a problem. That problem already exists. The issue is how will Boaz respond to Ruth's proposal? So you don't have to have foils at all.
Okay.
It's not a requirement. You will have a protagonist and antagonist. To have a story, there's a problem. So that means there has to be a main character that's experiencing the problem. And then there has to be someone or something that is bringing about that problem. Foils may or may not be in the story.
All right. But is it also possible that within the story, it is only the protagonist and the foil, or in a certain narrative, or is there a requirement that there's an antagonist or there's a protagonist? And in connection to the overarching theme, like for example, I have my passage in John. I'm John chapter 3. I'm really confused about Nicodemus and Jesus. So I'm confused if Nicodemus was the antagonist, or I know that Jesus there is the protagonist. So I kind of consider the antagonist to consider the overarching thing, which is the Pharisees. So I just I don't know if that's right, because I think that Nicodemus is the foil. So my question is it possible that in that particular passage, so we consider is it possible that it's only the protagonist and the foils, and then for the antagonist you can connect it to the overarching scenario or theme of the story? Is it that possible, Pastor Tim?
Yeah, sometimes, but you're always going to have, and this is the hard part in like the bigger narratives like John.
Hmm.
And it's something I want you guys to wrestle with, is not every story in the book is like a self-contained with its own mini plot. Some of the all the stories are linked to the overall narrative. Some of the stories, like John 4 or John 9 and 10, or John uh, um, chapters 5 through 7, those do sort of have their own plot in the bigger plot. But like John 3 is a little bit tougher because it's Jesus and Nicodemus. So what you want to do is say, okay, do I see a problem here in the passage, in this story? And there is a problem there in that story, right? Right. So you got to identify that problem. There's the bigger problem of, yes, the Pharisees are against Jesus. The real problem in the Gospel of John is unbelief.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's written the book to encourage belief. But Jesus encounters unbelief. And so really, this is the problem in that gospel. And the Pharisees are one of the primary the primary party that's guilty of unbelief and trying to hinder others from believing. So they would be the antagonists of the book as a whole. So yeah, in one sense, Nicodemus, as part of the Pharisees, is he an antagonist in that way? Well, he doesn't seem to be opposing Jesus in John 3, right? He's not fighting him. But he is confused about what it means to follow Christ, to be born again. And so that's linked to this idea of unbelief. Will Nicodemus believe or not? Right? And so that interaction, as Jesus is telling him, you must be born again. The issue there is, how is Nicodemus going to respond to that message? Will he accept it or not? The problem is unbelief.
Yes.
Okay. So once you've identified a problem, then you can see, okay, is there an antagonist? There's a protagonist. Jesus is going to be the protagonist, right? He's the main guy. That's an easy one in all the stories in John. But the antagonist, generally speaking, is the Pharisees. But as we're going to see in John 4, the antagonist isn't really a person in that story as much as it's what the culture from the Pharisees are pushing on, that you can't interact with the Samaritans, especially with a woman. So the problem is the cultural prejudice, which is promoted and encouraged by the Pharisees, but the Pharisees aren't in John 4 in that case. But still they're in the background promoting the problem. So my key point is just try to identify the problem in your story. If you can't, then maybe the story you have really is just part of what John is building in the narrative overall for the whole gospel. So how does your story fit in that? Like John 2, right? Some of you have the water turned to wine. So there is a problem in that story, right? They run out of alcohol. they run out of booze at the wedding. And so we do have in that story, there is sort of a problem. And what does Jesus do in response to the problem? But that story, though, is strategic by John in his gospel as a whole, because at the end it says this is the first sign that Jesus performed. What sign? The sign that shows he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, so that the reader would believe. Okay? So you want to deal with the story and the issue, the problem in the story. But then you want to step back and say, okay, well, what is the importance of this story within the narrative? And then you apply that to your hearers. How does that, the main idea, main point of this story connect to your hearers? So that's the difficult part. Narratives are hard. Narratives are hard. The first hard part is trying to figure out what's the author's point. And then the second hard part is how does that apply to my hearers? And we have to be careful, because if we end up just making the story about the human characters and their example, then you've likely missed the point. Okay, you can do that. We can see illustrations, good or bad examples in human characters in the Bible stories. That's not wrong to do. But we first want to understand, though, what is the message the author's trying to, or is communicating? What's the message that the theme, the focus from the author? What's the point of this story he wants us to understand? And then from that, okay, how does that point connect or apply to us today? All right, so you're looking at Jonah, right? God's compassion for the lost. Has that changed today? Right? Of course not, right? And really, Jonah ends with that question because I think it is really meant to be a question to the reader. That's why he ends the story right after that. And in Ruth, God's providence in showing kindness to Naomi, to these two widows, to care for them, and at the same time, his providence for Israel, to care for Israel. All right, so what about that theme might connect to us today? Does God still show his providential care for his children today? He does. And so you can sort of connect with what, in this part of the story that I'm teaching, how might that, God's providence and how it's showing itself in this part of the story, how might that connect to my hearers and how I should respond? So like for, Ruth and Boaz, for example, they respond in faith and they show faithfulness to, like Boaz, he's following the law, right? The kinsman redeemer, he's faithful to do that. So there is examples from the human characters, but don't disconnect that from the broader point of the story. That knowing God's providence in our lives, we too should be faithful to God's instruction. Right? Knowing God's compassion for the lost, we too should have compassion for the lost, especially those who are not like us. Okay? So, but this is a challenge. It may sound easy now that I say this, right? Like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But the challenge is being able to figure that out in the various stories in Scripture. If you're in the book of Judges and you're going through that book and you come across some of these stories and you go, oh, what in the world? How does this apply to my hearers, right? Jephthah's daughter. I mean, that's just a crazy story. Like, what, this father who sacrifices his daughter because he's given victory in battle, what's going on there? Right? Or the Levite who cuts up his concubine because she got raped, and like there's some wicked stuff going on there. So you really need to understand what's the author doing. Why is he including that story? How does it connect to the focus of the book overall? Okay. So these are what makes the stories a little bit more challenging. But knowing the purpose of the story, understanding the problem of the story, then guides and directs us towards the main characters of the story. And then, as we'll see in the next step of narrative analysis, it guides us towards the plot of the story, which is what reveals the point of the story. Okay? All right, well, I covered a lot of ground there. But any questions or comments about that? Hopefully, it was a long answer to Chrysler's short question, but hopefully that
You get Dr. Tim.
did that answer your question at least, Chrysler? Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah. So I just have to read it again and try to identify the problem and try to compare.
Yeah. Yep.
But I'll just ask it again. I'll just message you, Pastor Tim.
Sure.
If
Yeah, and
thanks.
if you're having trouble like within the story, kind of seeing, the problem or the main characters, then you want to just step back and say, okay, maybe this story is really part of the bigger narrative. And so how does it fit in that bigger narrative? And that might help you a little bit. Like in Nicodemus's case, Jesus, of course, the protagonist in the whole gospel. And like I said, in that case, and the issue of belief or unbelief runs through the whole gospel. And so you might ask, okay, how does this story connect to those things? Okay. So the problem may be in that story you have really being part of the bigger problem of the book overall. So yeah, it takes some skill in trying to, and discernment and trying to figure out how each story, what happened there? How each story connects to the story overall. And that's what makes especially the bigger narratives more difficult. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, John, many of the Old Testament books, Pentateuch, that's a massive story, right? The Pentateuch's all one book, right? Made up of those 5, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? That's all one book. It's called the book of singular Moses. Then you've got Kings, Chronicles. These are huge books, but they do have one guiding purpose of the book, a primary message of the book, but there's so many stories within the book. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to know how they connect. And then finally, what do I do with a story when I teach it to my congregation or my, Bible study group or whoever the audience is? Okay. So we got to break it down, look at the setting first. Like we talk, well, first do the book analysis, read the book, background context of the book, then the contextual flow of the book. And then we do the narrative analysis for each story in the book or the story that we're wanting to teach. And that then is what's the setting here, and then doing the scenes, and then now stepping back and looking at the characters. And so there are really 5 main characters. You've got the protagonist, the antagonist, right? So they're gonna be surrounding the problem. The foils may or may not be in each particular story, but there may be a character or characters who serve as a contrast or comparison to either the protagonist or the antagonist. And then you have the narrator. Now, he's not a character in the story, but he's the one directing the story. Of course, he's the author. So he's the one that is including particular comments or insights, describing events, maybe sometimes describing the person's thoughts or other things that are happening, the setting. So the narrator is a key part of the story in that he is guiding and directing the things he wants to make sure we know and understand. Okay, now in the scene analysis, I had you identify narrator comments in each scene. In the character analysis, you're going to step back and say, okay, as I look at all the narrator comments as a whole, what seems to be significant for the whole story? In scene analysis, you're just identifying the narrator comments that seem to be important for that scene. In the character analysis, you sort of step back, look at all the narrator comments, and then decide which ones seem to be important for the whole story. Okay? And then finally, the main character of the Bible is God himself. So we don't want to forget or neglect to identify God's role in the story. Sometimes it's very direct, like Ruth. I believe he'd be the antagonist in that story. In Jonah, he's the protagonist. In the Gospel of John, of course, Jesus is the protagonist. So you're going to want to make sure you identify God's role in the story and what it reveals about his character. Okay? So in the character analysis, these are the 5 characters you're going to want to note and then describe the key statements or actions of each of them. Okay? So when you do the character analysis, the first thing you want to do is identify the characters. So you identify the protagonist. Why did you choose that person as the protagonist? Well, right, they're the main character who experiences the problem. Then the antagonist. You identify who that is, and then you need to know why. And then the foils. Okay, so I show you that. Let me just pull this up. Okay, here's assignment 212, which is the character analysis for the Ruth or Jonah passage. And then notice here, by the way, guys, pay careful attention to my examples. I pretty much lay out exactly what I want you to do in your for your passage. Okay. Most of you guys are doing that, but sometimes I notice guys aren't following the example I gave you. So I just want you to make sure you're paying attention to that. Okay. So here, notice I put the protagonist Abraham. I should have probably put down why that is, because right, he's the one for which the problem is created. Right. You could put the problem. He is told to sacrifice his son, right? That's a problem in this story. Who's the one that created the problem? God did, right? In this case. And then the foils, I mentioned here, the 2 servants. There are other characters in the story in Genesis 22, but the author doesn't seem to be using them as a comparison or a contrast. So I don't think there are any foils there, story. Okay? And then that brings us to the 3rd step, unless there are there any questions so far on what we've covered? Okay. So we identify each of the key characters in the story, and then we want to describe each character. Okay. Now, what this means is it doesn't mean like, tell me, if you're doing Ruth chapter 3, right? It doesn't mean, okay, so tell me something about Boaz. Well, Boaz is a nice guy, and he's really shows kindness in the story. I don't mean describe him that way. What I mean is identify the key dialogue and actions of each character. What seems to be important to the story by what they say and do. And then I mentioned the narrator here, identify the important statements by the narrator. The narrator doesn't do any action in the story, but he does make important statements in the story. Okay? So, again, for example, I showed you in 2-point assignment 212, right? I describe some, like for Abraham, what are the key statements he made and what are the key actions that he did? Okay. And then for the antagonist, for God, it did the same thing. And then the narrator. So that's what you want to do in this step. You're describing the key dialogue and key actions of each character, what seems to be important to the story. Now, this is interpretive, right? You're trying to decide, okay, what statements did this character make that seem important? That's interpretive. But hopefully by this point in the story, you've done the setting, you've read through it a number of times, you have made observations, you've done the scene analysis, so you've looked at each scene in detail. Now, again, you're going back to the character analysis, you're reading through the story, you've identified characters. Hopefully at this point, you probably have a pretty good idea of what the story's about. But even if you're not, totally sure, still, you know enough about the story that you can, I think, identify generally what seems to be important or significant in the story. All right? At least at this step, you're making that attempt. Okay? So some of it you may get wrong. Some of it you'll get right. So, but the idea is at this stage, okay, when Abraham said this or did this, did that seem to be important to the story? Yeah, I think so. And here's why. So that's what you're doing at this step. Okay? And then identify God's role in the story. Again, that's like, what do we learn about God's character and his actions within the story? Okay? So let's do this in the time we have. We'll just try to get through a little bit of John 4 as an example. Unless you guys have any questions overall or questions about your particular passage, I'd be happy to address those. If not, we'll move to John 4, do a little bit of that. Okay, and I'm going to ask, again, just to familiarize ourselves with the story. We'll read it through once. I pulled up the NIV version just to do a different translation of it. So I'm going to ask if Jason can read verses 1 to 6 here. And then Nigel, if you could take 7 to 12. Godwin, if you could take 13 to 18. Yancey, 19 to 24. Stephen, 25 to 30. Chrysler, if you could do 31 to 36. And then Hubert, if you could do 37 to 42. All right. Okay, I don't remember who I assigned to what, so hopefully you guys remember, but I think I asked Jason to start us off 1 to 6. And as you guys are reading, just kind of take note, all right? We're trying to identify the main characters and their key statements and actions. Jason?
John chapter 4, verse 1. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the sixth hour.
Verse 7. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his flocks and herds?"
Verse 13. Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I gave him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I gave him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have had five husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true."
Verse 19. "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus declared, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth."
The woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I who speak to you am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Then leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I did. Could this be the Christ?" They came out of the town and made their way toward him.
Chrysler, I think it's your turn. Is he there? Oh, looks like he stepped away. Luber, can you do 31 verses 31 to 36? You're muted.
Okay. Meanwhile, his disciples urged him, "Rabbi, something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." Then his disciples said to each other, "Could someone have brought him food?" "My food," said Jesus, "is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say, 4 months more and then the harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. Even now, the reaper draws his wages. Even now, he harvests the crop for eternal life, so that the sower and the reaper may be glad together.
All right. I guess I'll finish it up. Thus the saying, one sows and another reaps is true. I sent you to reap what you have not worked for. Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them. And he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. All right, so that's the story we've got here with John 4. I think you were familiar with it. And so then normally what we would do, and I won't go through this with you now since we've made observations before. You'll have these in the notes. Just these were some additional observations after I read through the story several times again, and other things that I noticed that I didn't notice before. And then I also noted a few things that I saw in the NIV. Before I had been doing the New American Standard Bible. I've been using it. For this exercise, I read the NIV and identified some things I noticed from that. Okay. And again, I'll put these in, but the idea is just making examples with that. So now what we want to do is identify each character, main character in this story. All right. I think the protagonist, the main character, is pretty easy, right? Who would we say that is? It's going to be the same in every one, right?
Jesus.
Jesus is, obviously, right? Jesus is the main character. Now, remember what I said. The important thing is identifying the antagonist. Okay, how do we do that? How do we determine the antagonist? The protagonist is Jesus. And we think about the antagonist, who might be some options in this story? Who seem to be some other main characters? The protagonists or the antagonist could be.
The woman,
The woman,
Okay, we have the woman.
the
We have
disciples,
the disciples.
the culture, the
We have
Samaritans.
we have the Samaritans. Okay, these are other characters in the story that could be in the role of antagonists, but we have to stop for a minute and say, okay, how do we determine the antagonist? Well, we remember the antagonist is the one who creates or makes worse the problem in the story. So we have to ask, well, okay, well, what's the problem in this story?
The problem is the status quo that Jews could not associate with Samaritans.
Yeah, I think so. Right? Because notice here, I'll do the full screen so you could see the text on the right here. I'll explain why I did these colors different in a minute. But the problem in the story, notice we have the woman asks, how can you, a Jew, ask for a drink? I'm a Samaritan woman. Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And then down in verse 27, the disciples came and were amazed or were shocked. He was speaking with a woman. And in this context, the Samaritan woman. But nobody asked him, why do you speak to her? What do you seek? So we see in this story that some might say, well, the Samaritan woman seems to be the problem, right? She doesn't want to listen to Jesus. Well, okay, maybe. That seems to be the case, but she's still willing to talk with them at the beginning, and they have a dialogue. So I think the bigger problem is the cultural prejudice that would prevent Jesus from even talking to this woman. Right? What does Jesus want to do here? He's telling her he's the Messiah, right? He's revealing to her the truth that he is the coming one. But if he were to follow the expectations of the culture, he wouldn't have even spoken with her. So I think in studying the story and understanding in the big picture of the Gospel of John, again, what's John trying to do? Show that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and so that believing we have my life in his name. And Jesus is seeking to do that in this story, but what is it that's trying to prevent him? Cultural prejudice. Now, there's no Pharisee in this account, but certainly they promoted that prejudice, right? We see it in other places, right? When they condemn Jesus for eating with tax gatherers and sinners, right? And even in the disciples, we see this attitude. So I think this is a unique story in that the antagonist isn't really a person in this particular story. It's really the cultural prejudice that creates the problem here. The woman doesn't create the problem. The disciples even don't create the problem. Remember, they don't say anything. They're like, oh, what's he doing talking to that woman? But they don't say anything. So they don't create the problem, but they demonstrate or manifest the existence of the problem, which is the cultural prejudice against foreigners, the Jewish prejudice against foreigners, and really the Samaritan prejudice against the Jews, right? This was a long-standing. So we would need to understand the background of this story to know this. Okay, we need to have an idea, again, because we're placing ourselves, we have to place ourselves in the shoes of the original audience here. And even the original audience would not have been aware of the problem. So that's why John inserts that comment. Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. To help us see this problem. You guys following me? Okay, normally, in most stories, the antagonist is going to be a person. Okay, but not always. In this case, I think, yes, the people are behind the problem here, but in this particular story, it's the cultural prejudice that is the problem here. And so Jesus, that's what he's being opposed by in this situation. So I would put for the antagonist, I would put none of these. Okay. The problem in the story is the cultural prejudice that would seek to prevent Jesus from having any interaction with these foreigners or with a woman. I don't think I spelled that right. Okay. So I would say the antagonist is the cultural prejudice. And then for the clues, we have verse 9 and verse 27. Okay. Now, you even kind of almost have a little bit of a hint in verse 1. Notice when the Lord knew the Pharisees had heard Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples, he left. Right? So we do see a mention of the Pharisees in the introduction, in the setting. And again, they are in the background in this story, but they become more prominent in chapter 5 and following in attacking Jesus and being the antagonist in the gospel as a whole. But here it's more of the cultural prejudice that they promote that exists in the culture, the bias, the racism. that is there that would cause a problem here. Okay, so that leaves us then with, okay, what about the foils? Does that mean the woman, the disciples, are they foils in the story?
Some could be.
Some could be. So we want to think about, do they serve as a contrast or a comparison? And I would say, well, think about the disciples for a minute. Could they serve as a comparison or contrast to the protagonist or the antagonist in the story?
Yes. They align with the cultural prejudice, the disciples.
Yes.
So they compare. They're a comparison.
They align with the cultural prejudice. So they would compare with the antagonist and also contrast with Jesus, right? Because they don't talk to the Samaritans at all, but Jesus does. So I think definitely they would serve as a foil here in this account. So we have to think, okay, how about the woman? Might she be a foil of some sort?
They contrast with the prejudice also.
She might contrast, with the prejudice, and I think she contrasts in this case with the disciples. Because what does she do when she finds out Jesus is the Messiah? She runs back and tells her fellow villagers. But the disciples didn't. They were in the village. They didn't say anything. They got the food and, I think I joke in the sermon I preached there, they got their Jollibees. They went to Jollibees, got the food and got out of there, right? But the woman, she goes back and she says, "Look, I've met the Messiah. Come out and see him." Now the disciples, shouldn't they have said that too? Shouldn't they have at least said, "Hey, the Messiah is here. Do you want to meet him?" They didn't. But the woman did. So I think there's a little bit of sophistication in the story, even in contrasting the Samaritan woman with the disciples. And then we have the Samaritans. I don't know. They might serve as a foil in some sense. Definitely the focus of the story is that they come to believe at the very end. But yeah, I think I would at least have the disciples and the woman at the well in that category of foils. Okay? All right, so this story is a little more sophisticated in terms of identifying these key characters, but at least the antagonists and the foils. I think the protagonist is pretty straightforward. Okay, so after identifying the key characters, then the next thing we want to do is describe each character. And for this, what I typically do, I did this for Genesis, the Genesis example, is I highlight, let's see, and I'll show on the left first here. This is the story as a whole. And what I've done is I've highlighted each character. So the non-highlighted text is the narrator. The green is the Samaritan woman. The yellow is Jesus, his dialogue, what he says. And then the blue is the disciples. And then the gray at the end here is the Samaritans. But notice as you look at the story as a whole, we see the narrator comments are more at the beginning of each scene. They're mostly at the beginning of each scene. And notice the green, Jesus has a lot of dialogue, but the most dialogue, sorry, the yellow is Jesus. But notice the Samaritan woman has quite a bit of dialogue as well. The disciples have very little, as does the Samaritans in the village. So what I do at this point is just kind of like looking at what I've highlighted here. That helps me visually to sort of focus on what seems to be the important comments from each of the characters. And for the story as a whole now, so I'm looking at the whole story. I broke it by scenes here just to help me a little more clear on who's speaking and who isn't. But when we're doing character analysis, we want to look at the story as a whole. Okay? So, with that being said, we want to then consider, okay, what are some key statements or actions by the protagonist, by Jesus in this particular story? All right, maybe I'll open it up to you guys if you have anything. Normally I'd give you some time and do it on your own, but we're almost out of time this morning. But does anybody have any thoughts as to what are some key statements that Jesus makes in the story? Again, highlighted in yellow. What are
Give
some
me a
key
drink.
actions? Sorry?
Give me a drink.
Okay,
The
verse
initial verse
7, right?
7:7.
Yeah, this really starts the whole conversation, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it's a startling request, knowing the culture, right? Is that right? The woman's response, right? How can you ask for a drink? That shouldn't be done. Any other key statements by Jesus here that stick out to you? I think a big one in verse 26, right? I who speak to you am he, am who? Jesus declares he is the Messiah. That doesn't happen very often. So that's a very significant remark he makes in this story. Any others that stick out to you?
The spiritual drink. Everyone who drinks this water will thirst, but whoever drinks will never thirst. From verse 13 to 14.
Yeah, the living water. Jesus speaks. Good.
Verse 18. Yeah, 5 husbands.
Verse 18. Yeah, Jesus points out her immoral lifestyle, right? Which is really, which is what gets a woman's attention, right? Because when she goes to the village, she says, he told me everything, he knew everything about me, right? So he was able to reveal something that, even though he's a stranger, he knew something personal about her. Okay, good. And then he speaks on his comments about true worship, right?
Yes, the mountain where to worship.
Right. And in verses 23 and 24 is who to worship and how. All right. So this idea, so you just want to going through the text. There's some more key comments. Did I put them down here? I don't think I did. And I'll provide them in the notes. But you just go through and just focus on what Jesus said or did that's significant in the story. And then we turn our attention to the antagonist, which is the prejudice of the culture. And we already noted the key verses there. We would look at verse 9. Okay, the antagonist doesn't say anything in the story because it's not a person in the story, but we certainly see, right, Jews have no dealings. So this is a narrator comment, but it's applied to this is the antagonist in the story. And then verse 27, right, the disciples were amazed. Jesus. Okay. And then the foils, we would go through and talk about, okay, the disciples, what they don't say much. Right, but they do express, right? They were amazed. Speaking with a woman, so I might note that. Amazed, shocked. So they show the prejudice there, the racism. And then, of course, they're focused on, right, when they say, Rabbi, eat, and then no one brought him anything to eat, they're focused on the earthly rather than the heavenly, right? Because Jesus says, I have food that you don't know about. And they're thinking, what did somebody bring him some food? So I would just note those couple of things here. Okay, so that's the idea. Again, I'll include in the notes all the details so you can have them. Also for the Samaritan woman. So what are some things that they said or did that's significant? You want to point those out. And then finally, just focusing on the key narrator comments, all right, in the story. For example, verse 4, he had to pass through Samaria. Verse 9, the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Verse 25, he interprets Messiah for his non-Jewish readers. He uses the Greek word there. Verse 27, he identifies like what might be on the disciples' mind, but they don't say anything. And then, of course, the many more believed. The Samaritans believed, right? That word believe is important in the flow of the Gospel of John. All right, so these are the things you would just take note of, what seems significant in the story as a whole. And then finally, God's role in the story? What does it reveal about God? And here, of course, we see much regarding Jesus in this case, but also the Father, right? Where's the Father mentioned in this story?
Verse 21.
Yeah,
23.
verses 21 through
On.
Or also 24.
24, right?
God is
Several things.
spirit.
Yeah, right? God is spirit. Um, the Father seeks true worshipers, right? You will worship the Father, right? Not in a place. So there's several things mentioned here about the Father. The Father sent the Son, right? My food is to do the will of him who sent me to accomplish his work. Verse 34. Father sent the Son to do his work. All right. So these would be things that you would notice. And then you might say, is the Holy Spirit mentioned here? Not explicitly, but certainly the work of the Spirit is seen, right? Because the woman believes, the Samaritans believe that we know theologically is a work of the Spirit. So even though the Holy Spirit's not mentioned explicitly, he's certainly part of this story, especially in verses 39 and 41. Okay, and then of course we see much about the Son here, right? His compassion for the lost, um, things like that. Okay, well, that was a quick sort of run through the character analysis. You'll have I'll put the full thing down in the notes, send them to you guys, or post them on Canvas. But I just wanted to give you an idea, reminder, as you're going through your particular account in John, um, the character analysis there. Okay, so again, I'm sorry it was rushed. So a lot there, but hopefully just good review, remind you of what we're looking for. Any questions before we conclude today? Does your daughter have any questions, Stephen? Did everything make sense to her?
Yes. No
Okay.
prejudice.
Yeah, she's pretty sharp. Okay, well, like I said, I'll post the detailed responses I gave to each of these characters. And if you have any questions about that or about your text or just in general, yeah, feel free to message me. And I'll be happy to respond to that. Many of you guys have been, asking questions, messaging me, which is fine. I want to help, so it's not a burden at all, or don't feel like you're troubling me or anything. I want to be helpful if I can. Okay, and then yeah, keep working on those assignments. Encourage your brothers to press forward and help them if needed. And look forward, Lord willing, to seeing you guys next week. We'll look at the plot, sort of bring it all together. I already really talked about plot stuff today a little bit, so we'll just sort of bring that together next week and review that for John 4 and address that topic as well. Okay? All right. Well, thanks for your input, guys. I was going to ask if Jason wouldn't mind closing our time in prayer.